Hey, what's going on, guys? SeeJayAre here today with another Shortcuts video. Today I just wanted to discuss podcasts. I've been listening to podcasts since pretty much their inception. I go way back to the Ricky Gervais show. That started as kind of the biggest podcast at the time. Adam Carolla podcast I was listening to way back. This would have been 2007, maybe 8, when podcasts were just kind of coming around. Podcasts are absolutely fantastic for any category, anything you're into. Basically, they're like talk radio, but just geared towards specifically what you're into. I use them all the time. I listen to podcasts constantly. I don't go to sleep without having a podcast on. I listen to podcasts all night. Well, I don't listen to them while I'm sleeping, but to go to sleep, I have to have a podcast running. I used to watch TV and just leave the TV on, just because it kept my mind from racing and stressing. It was a bit of a distraction. So now I do that with podcasts. I fall asleep listening to podcasts. When I worked at the hospital, for a good period, I worked nights and I was by myself, so I would have podcasts running the whole time. Back when I was in school, it was podcasts on the way to school and back. Road trips, it's always podcast. I always make sure if we're driving to Florida or up north, camping, anything like that, that I've got a full deck of podcasts ready to go. So I'm a huge podcast fan. I just kind of wanted to go over some of the ones that I really enjoy and that I've been listening to. And I also wanted to get your feedback on what you guys are listening to. Anyways, let's check out what I have been listening to in terms of podcasts over the past couple of years. All right, so hopefully this is going to show up pretty well on the camera here. I just use the basic podcast app from iTunes. I know there's been a lot of complaints about this, and there's probably far better ones out there. This is just what I use and what I know. I'm not sure what the latest and greatest is on Android, but this is what I use. I'm just going to quickly go through what I listen to right now. First off, hopefully that'll focus. P.S. I Love You, XOXO. That's a PlayStation specific podcast from the guys from former IGN. I'm drawing a blank. Greg Miller. They used to do the PlayStation. What was it? Beyond? PlayStation, is it Beyond? They used to run the Beyond podcast. Anyways, they've gone off on their own. They run their whole podcast network. It's the Kind of Funny Games cast. It's the guys from kindoffunny.com. They've got a really big YouTube presence right now. So I highly recommend Kind of Funny Games cast. And if you're into PlayStation, P.S. I Love You, PlayStation specific podcast. Below that, we have the new Bill Simmons podcast. I also listen to a lot of sports podcasts. So Bill Simmons is fantastic. He used to be with ESPN, but they basically gave him the boot and fired him. So he went out and started his own podcast network on his own. Dunked on basketball. You can skip that. How did this get made? This is a podcast about really bad movies, and they talk about how they got made. And they go through and make fun of choices that have been made in these movies. It's a really good movie podcast. One of the best out there. Next up here, I'll go to the top of the list. Giant Bombcast. Actually, this is the Giant Beastcast. Giant Bombcast is down here. Giant Bombcast, Jeff Gersman, former, the team is all former GameSpot employees, members. They went off on their own years ago. They were the first ones to really go out on their own. And they started giantbomb.com. Since then, that website's actually been bought by GameStop again. So now they're back to being actual GameSpot employees. They're tied in under the CBS family, I think. So anyways, Giant Bombcast, highly recommend. This is probably the most famous gaming podcast around. And that ties into this is the Giant Beastcast. This is the podcast run by their East Coast office. Gamers with Jobs conference call. That's a really good one. Not much to say about that. It's gamers who have day jobs, so I believe they're not industry professionals. One of my favorites, the Why Are You Listening to This podcast? It's run by two YouTubers, or one YouTuber and one former YouTuber, I should say. JCAU99 and Burning Toys. Really good podcast. Definitely not for children, but I'm really finding that that's one of my favorite podcasts to listen to. As I mentioned, the kind of funny games cast, a generic gaming
not generic, but like it covers all consoles. Retronauts is back. This is an old 1UP podcast. I used to listen to a lot of 1UP podcasts back in the day. A lot of that's the staff from 1UP is back for Retronauts. They go over a lot of retros. So you can see there's like a retrospective on Mario 64, Qbert. Some of them I skip. But when they do see, there's one here on the NES launch. There's one on all Metal Gear Solid games. Really good stuff. Really knowledgeable people too. Canada Land is a Canada-specific podcast. This is about it's about media coverage. It's a guy who keeps the Canadian media in check and calls them out on all their mistakes. Really interesting political podcast. Low Post, basketball podcast. The one of note here is Jalen and Jacoby. That's a must-download podcast if you're into sports at all. Really fantastic. Jalen Rose is extremely knowledgeable. He spent a lot of time playing here in Toronto, but I never realized how intelligent Jalen Rose is. Really, really interesting. Jalen and Jacoby. Next up, gaming podcast, DLC, Jeff Kanata. Big fan of Jeff Kanata. He was on the Totally Rad show for years, so I've really followed him, and I find that a lot of his views on games and movies are really in line with mine, so I really enjoy DLC. Vic's Basement is the Electric Playground podcast. Highly recommend you check that out. I posted on my social media recently. That's a video game show that's run out of Canada that's been running now for 20 seasons. It's the only video game show on television, which is insane. And this is the podcast associated with those guys, Victor Lucas and his two co-hosts. Up next is the Completely Unnecessary podcast. They touch on a little bit of everything, but they go through a lot of retro gaming stuff. That's why this one's here. I used to be a bigger fan of this than I am now. But I still enjoy listening to it. Smodcast, Kevin Smith. Really enjoy him. To be honest, I don't listen to Smodcast much anymore. The Starters is an NBA podcast. Major Nelson Radio. Don't really listen to this one either. It's a little bit too Xbox Insider, kind of really biased. Radio Free Nintendo is probably one of the best Nintendo-specific podcasts. Really enjoy that. All Gen Gamers is no longer around. PlayStation Nation podcast is the most biased podcast you will ever listen to. There's a guy on there, Glenn. He's from Milwaukee. He's always at Midwest Gaming Classic. He is the biggest PlayStation fanboy. He talks nothing but crap about Xbox One, which, you know, I still do enjoy the PlayStation podcast, Nation podcast, just because there's a lot of good PlayStation information, and I really enjoy the host's enthusiasm. I do like the host, even if they are extremely biased. Rebel FM. These are former IGN and a couple former 1UP guys. Rebel FM, that's been around for quite a while. 8-4 Play is a Japan, so it's English-speaking North Americans mostly, working in Japan as people who they translate video games. So they give their perspective on gaming from English-speaking people living in Japan, if that makes sense. Idle Thumbs podcast, another gaming podcast with mixed in a lot of comedy type stuff. That's a good one. And then these are all the IGN typical. These are the ones most people know. Game Scoop, the UK podcast. Nintendo Voice Chat's still really good. I really listen to that. Game Scoop, and then I get my Xbox One or Xbox fix with Podcast Unlocked through IGN.
All right, guys, so that's it. That's most of the podcasts I've been listening to for the last couple years, actually. Like I said, I'd love to know what you guys are listening to and what your thoughts are on those podcasts. Feel free to leave a comment below if I missed any podcasts that you really enjoy. I'm always looking for new ones. As I said, I probably listen to at least 2 hours of podcasts a day. If I'm cleaning, if I'm doing anything, I've got a podcast running. If I'm down here, usually I'm listening to a podcast. So yeah, feel free to check out any of those podcasts. They're all available on iTunes, and I believe Stitcher is one that people use a lot. But yeah, I'd really like to know what you guys are listening to, so leave a comment below. And as always, you can find me on Instagram, Facebook at SeeJayAre. Links are in the description below. And thank you so much for watching. Stay tuned. I've got more videos coming on. I've got some time off this week, so I'm going to be shooting a top 10 Dreamcast video, favorite Christmas movies. I am going to do a little series, part of this shortcut series called Why Did I Buy This?, where I just kind of go through things that I bought out of impulse and really shouldn't have. Thought that'd be kind of interesting because I've got a lot of stuff down here that I probably shouldn't have bought. But anyway, stay tuned for those, and as always, thank you so much for watching, and until the next episode.